You know all those miserable towns you find in fantasy RPGs like The Witcher and Diablo? Usually in a swamp where the locals live in a precarious balance with whatever monstrosity demands they feed it children? How do they even survive out there? That's the idea behind Gord, a blend of role-playing, real-time strategy, and colony simulation that should lead to making tough choices in areas like careful building, precarious combat, and tense emergent story. Instead, each of the three aspects is implemented in such a bare-bones way that not one of them is deeper than a quagmire or remotely entertaining. The result is about as engaging as living in a swampy, miserable town you're desperate to leave. And when you finally do, and your parents ask why you never visit, you tell them it's not only because their town is not fun, it has bad inventory management to boot. Gord's set in a dark fantasy world that takes the term seriously, to the point where its sun is apparently dead. It's dark all the time. Monsters haunt the wilds just outside the door, and the extended darkness is having a real effect on people's sanity. It's a decent enough world premise, with some neat character design and intriguing plots. But the story you actually play out is a bit of a drag. Your job, as a representative of a soon-to-be conquering king, is to push around a weak local tribe so they can serve as guides in the coming invasion. That means establishing new outposts, stockaded settlements called Gords, in the monster-infested mires, highlands, and woods. You'll also occasionally deal with monsters that are too strong to fight. These things, called horrors, will demand you do something like sacrifice a child or fetch their lost stuff. This sounded promising, like it would kick off some hard life and death choices, but realistically you just do whatever they want and move on with no consequences. Yeah, even the child sacrifices, which you'd think would be something that'd come back to bite you.
Our brother needs help.
The plot delves into a Slavic-inspired dark fantasy spiel about dead gods and epic conflicts, but it does so without any real flair or dramatic voice. It's just people regurgitating backstory in lieu of anything notable happening right now. Most of the background comes from the form of a lore journal, the Chronicle, that narrates stories at you in pseudo-archaic language. None of the writing is either meaningful or memorable. This disgusting wretch delivers the lone good performance and manages to salvage his own cliche-ridden lines, but even he can do nothing to lift up everyone and everything else.
Or else, we'll have nowhere to run.
Of course, I've seen worse stories fail to sink a solid game, but Gord's gameplay turns out to be uninspired and shallow as well. Part of that is because every building in your Gord of 6 to 18 villagers must be made inside the palisades so that it's protected. So space is at a premium, as are resources. Sometimes you need to make a choice like, do we want fishermen or hunters? In practice though, you'll just play fiddly Tetris with building placement and, as a worst case scenario, knock down something you no longer need to make room. Later you can just expand the walls, so the limited space never becomes a challenge to think your way through. It's nothing like the strong base building defense games of recent years, with neither the defensive flair of They Are Billions or the thoughtful resource management of Northgard. That might be fine if the colony sim was deeper than a 5-resource, dozen-building RTS, or if the characters had engaging personalities with strengths, weaknesses, wants, and needs. Alas, there simply isn't enough variety of buildings and resources to make Gord function as a compelling colony sim. Its 20-hour campaign focuses on scenarios that are each about an hour and a half long, which means you repeat the same build order over and over, occasionally modifying it when the campaign trickles out a new building or upgrade tier. Every task has a best way to meet its challenge, from food gathering to map exploration, that quickly becomes repetitive to execute. A scant few scenarios made me change my template. A map with long winters means you can't rely on mushroom gathering, for example, and should trade for more of your food. More of that would have gone a long way to help break Gord out of its laborious rut. On top of this, you have villages that are your RTS-style units, each with a health, sanity, and faith meter. Sanity is the most interesting of the three, decreasing the longer someone spends away from the Gord in the dark and alone, whereas health and faith are just pools of points to keep full so that they stay alive and/or act as batteries so you can use spells. In classic colony builder style, each also has skills that make them better or worse at certain tasks than other villagers, alongside a few personality quirks that are, generally speaking, very, very easy to ignore because they provide an extremely rare circumstantial penalty or bonus. Nobody cares that you're afraid of plant monsters, Jim. You spend all your time on the wheat farm. And a guy who's only good at fighting but loses sanity in combat is just a waste of food and gold. So I'd just make him fist fight bears until he dies and frees up his spot for someone who isn't a burden.
A foe is attacking our structures! Is it safe yet?
Because for all the noise that Gord makes about being a survival game, it's just not that hard, even on the hardest difficulties. It's challenging, to be sure, but the challenge comes from tedious micromanagement of where your villagers are allowed to go and when. Most of the difficulty is in ensuring that Jim Thatcher gets a regular mead break so his sanity meter doesn't go all the way down, and that he doesn't blindly and suicidally wander into an obvious monster den on his quest for more reeds. It's a game of dark fantasy babysitting. Contrast that with recent colony building RTS Stranded: Alien Dawn, where managing individual characters is extremely dependent on their strengths and weaknesses, but rather than babysit them, you provide the basics, diversify resource income, and improve overall conditions, not personally remind them to drink enough water. That's not to mention the gulf in how nuanced combat is between the two games. Gord's monsters are not interesting to fight. Even when they're visually distinct or have a flashy ability you barely notice the effects of. Most battles are just rapid slaughters where your experienced soldiers wreck a pack of wolves or a few weird eyeball goblins without much input from you. Some skirmishes against big monsters, however, require you to diversify and properly micromanage a few unit types. Axes do the most damage, bows are ranged, spears are tough. There are theoretically unique enemy behaviors to exploit. Some attack your strongest soldiers first, others try to pick off your weakest. But this doesn't create diverse tactics. It just means you move in certain soldiers a few seconds after others, or pull a weakened unit back for a few moments so they can change target. Against the hardest enemies, you have to be sure you've got some faith stored up so you can cast a few basic heal, buff, or nuke spells mid-combat. But it never comes anywhere near the level of tactical depth you'd find in an RTS like Age of Empires 4 or Company of Heroes 3. Perhaps all that micromanaged village stuff and combat tactics wouldn't be so mind-numbing if not for a shockingly backward and obtuse user interface. Rather than a simple, straightforward unit panel, as has been seen in real-time strategy games for going on 25 years now, Gord has this inexplicably massive 3-page character sheet for each of your dozen or more villagers that takes up far too much screen space. Yes, each character's 3-slot inventory gets a whole page. So to swap items between characters, you've got to open this sheet and go to the right tab. None of these characters has more stats than a Warcraft 3 hero, but the way that same information is displayed here takes up, by my napkin math, 6 times the screen space, and then makes it tabbed. UI aside, Gord's realistic visual design is just visually cluttered. It's hard to see vital stuff you need to click on without activating the mode that highlights everything, and the dark color palette is so monotone that the few exceptions, like a snow-covered winter, come as a refreshing shock. Forests in particular are guilty of this. Look how you have to pan and rotate just to get a view of what's happening through the trees.
Somebody get me some food!
Any way you look at it, whether it's an RPG, a real-time strategy game, or a colony sim, Gord is as miserable as its downtrodden villagers. Other games are bad because they aim too high, attempt too much, and fall down on their own merits. They are at the very least hoisted on their own petard, doing us the favor of digging their own grave or being entertaining in their failures. Gord does not. It simply falls flat and rots where it lies, surrounded by monotonous micromanagement, a poor interface, and by-the-numbers combat. I am content to leave it there, but you may bury it if you like. For more, check out our reviews of Pikmin 4 and Jagged Alliance 3. For everything else, stick with IGN.